Okay, today I'm going to be talking about the disruption to thermoregulation. So this is required briefly for achieved, definitely for merit, and for excellence. You can get your excellence if you talk about how the disruption leads to a breakdown in the system. So basically, you're talking about how your hypothermia or hyperthermia got so severe that there's no coming back, and you get multiple organ failure and you get death. Okay, that's what I mean by the breakdown, and you can get an excellence if you do that. Okay, here's just a bit of information directly from the standard. I want to point out a couple of things. See how it is required for achieved, but you don't need to go into detail for achieved. It is required to focus on the extreme environment conditions. So I've highlighted there, you can see point 5, extreme environment conditions, and that's because I want you to stay focused on the environment. Don't go looking, you might, if you Google hyperthermia, you could find stuff related to drugs that can cause it, or being elderly. I just want you to leave that and focus on the task that you're given, which will be something to do with the environment, with being in an extreme environment. And just highlighting again, this is how you can get an excellence. There's 1, 2, 3 ways to get an excellence. And if you look at the third dot point, breakdown of the control system. So I'm going to walk you through that. Okay, so first of all, in your report, when you get up to this part, by the time you got to this part, you've already done your achieved section / merit section, which is describing the components and the mechanisms and how they work together. So now what you're doing, you should be working on explaining what a disruption is. So basically the disruption is a change in the core body temperature. So we can, remembering how normal fluctuations is what your thermoregulatory negative feedback loop, your homeostatic system, can deal with and does deal with on a daily basis. So going slightly above 37.5 and slightly below is fine, and that's maintained by your thermoregulatory center and homeostatic mechanisms. But when these fail, because the environment is so extreme, when these fail, there is a change in core body temperature. When that change is below 35 degrees, we call that hypothermia. When that change is above 40 degrees, that is called hyperthermia. And that's your disruption. Choose one of them to write about, not both. So what causes, let's go through hypothermia first. It's a good idea to just mention what causes it. Look at your task, look at and the situation that your task, or the context of your task, and find parts that you can link to describe why hypothermia might happen in that context. So here are some things that could happen. Basically, it's exposure to cold. You want to mention the how, so convection, radiation, or conduction. So if you've got cold air or wind, that's convection and radiation. And if you're exposed to a cold surface, so surface on surface, so it could be cold immersion in cold water, or it could be in this face planted in the snow, like this poor guy here, that's conduction. And you could talk about how heat loss is happening at a much rapid rate, so this is leading to a failure of your compensatory system mechanisms. They're not compensating. The negative feedback loop's not working to get you to normal temperature, so it's 30, you're hitting 35 or below. You could also, if you might have a chart, if there's a chart in the task with data, this particular one's wind chill, you could have a look at this and see how you could link that. So wind chill is basically the speed of the wind. It's a measurement of how cold it is and how strong it is. So the greater the wind speed, the greater the rate of heat loss, and that's because convection is happening at a faster rate. So looking for data in your task that you can explain why hypothermia could happen. on Google Classroom, you've got a document in that has got all the information with links on how the stages of hypothermia. Okay, I want to point out something important here is that you need to explain why any symptoms you've described have happened. So it's not enough to say some of the stages of mild hypothermia are that the face and skin might be white because there's vasoconstriction. You've got to say why and how the vasoconstriction happens. So you've got to, if you haven't explained it previously in your how the mechanism works together section, then you definitely need to be explaining it now. So you need to be talking about the autonomic nervous system, and it's a really good thing to talk about the sympathetic nervous system, and that's the fight or flight side of your autonomic nervous system, how it releases adrenaline, how adrenaline causes vasoconstriction. Okay, so you could be talking about how this is such a stress, a cold stress, body goes into fight or flight, which activates the sympathetic nervous system, and we get a whole cascade of events that happens from that. So it's adrenaline causes rapid contraction of skeletal muscle, which is shivering. So it's not enough to mention the symptoms and say there's uncontrollable shivering. Well, how did the shivering happen? Okay, so go back a step. Oh, that's because of adrenaline causes rapid skeletal muscle contraction. Oh, how did the adrenaline get there? Oh, that's because the sympathetic nervous system was activated. Why was the sympathetic nervous system activated? Oh, that's because it was a stress. It's a cold stress, okay? And your hypothalamus detected that because it's your control center. So you're talking about the hypothalamus. You go all the way back to the hypothalamus. Okay, so you won't get a merit if you're just mentioning symptoms and what it looks like. You have to explain how that happened. Okay, and here's just a bunch of information. You have this information on Google Classroom. There was a document that had the disruption. It's on the Google Classroom post called The Disruption. It's got links. I'm going to go over that a little bit later as well. Okay, so here's it's a summary of the readings on that post that I was just telling you about. So if you read the readings, you're going to find all of this information. Okay, so I'll just go over a couple of things actually that I haven't pointed out. So adrenaline also works on heart muscle cells. So remember we said adrenaline causes contraction. Well, your heart is a muscle, or it's full of muscle cells, it's cardiac muscle. So they increase contractility. So we get this thing called tachycardia. So tachycardia is increased heart rate. We get blood pressure increase. So this is hypothermia, mild hypothermia, the first stages of hypothermia. And you need to be talking about why. So you need to do the readings. I'll quickly tell you that overall you get systemic vasoconstriction. So vasoconstriction in more than just the arterioles that supply skin cells. There's overall vasoconstriction. So that increases your blood pressure, because if you think about it, your heart is a pump and it's pushing through all those blood vessels. It's got more, if everything's more constricted, it's got more work to do to get through. So it's got a higher pressure, just like a tap outside, your garden tap. If your hose is really narrow, you have to pump up the tap really high to get it to come out, or if you've got a knot in your tap. So kind of like that. Your extremities receive less blood flow because of the vasoconstriction, so you've got less dexterity. Basically that means you're a bit clumsier, you're uncoordinated. You could be talking about cerebral blood flow, which is your brain blood flow. Actually increases right at the start of hypothermia, but then it decreases, and we've got some data there. This is current data that it decreases at below 35 degrees. it decreases for every for every 1 drop in degrees Celsius, your central nervous system function decreases by 6 to 7 degrees. So what's that going to mean? Your central nervous system function decreases. Or what is your central nervous system? So that's your brain, your spinal cord. So we're talking about messages from the brain, spinal cord to the periphery. That's all slowing down. So you're going to get effects like motor function. So motor function, what I mean is doing things. You're going to be unco, basically. Your brain as well. If your central nervous system is affected, your thinking ability is going to be affected. So you're not going to be able to think clearly. You might be forgetful, and you do see that in the first signs of hypothermia. So it looks like confusion. It looks like amnesia. It looks like loss of coordination, and the fancy name for that is ataxia. So if you think about it, what's happening here is our total cellular metabolism. So all the reactions that are happening slower. So it results in a decrease in all the products of cellular metabolism. So we're talking about neurotransmitters as well. So that's why we're getting a slowing down of central nervous system function. If this keeps going on, it could get very bad. And so that's where we see the moderate, we're going to moderate now, effects of hypothermia. So before we had increased heart rate, now as hypothermia progresses, we're getting decreased heart rate. It's also called bradycardia. This has got to do with what I was telling you before about the decrease in central nervous system function. So nerves are conducting messages, electrical impulses, and that conduction speed slows down because of the cold. So, and even action potential slow down. And not only that, ion channels, they don't open as much as they were. Sometimes they don't even open. They open at the ion channel transport is delayed. So they're opening and closing a lot slower. Eventually they don't open and close. Eventually, you can talk about that later. We get loss of cerebral or brain blood flow, and it leads to more cognitive dysfunction, so even more confusion, but it gets so bad that there's apathy now. Apathy means you don't care either way. Slurred speech. Another interesting kind of symptom or thing you might see is limbs become stiff. And remember this thing you might have learned about in year 10 science, synovial fluid. That's the fluid between your joints, which keeps it's a shock absorber. Okay, that starts to go increase in viscosity, so get thicker, and limbs start to get stiffer. So at this point you may see paradoxical undressing. There's also a drop in respiration or respiratory rate. Okay, and severe. So this is where you could be getting your excellence if you explain all of that properly, and the why and the how. And if you talk about the breakdown now, this is where you could get your excellence. So this is where you would get so bad. If there's consciousness at all, the person could look intoxicated because their cognitive function has decreased so much because of the lack of blood flow, the slowing down of the central nervous system, slowing down of action potential, and ion transport channels. So there's also a blunted flight or fight response. So your sympathetic nervous system is blunted, and it was doing its job before of vasoconstriction, and it was stopping the warm blood from getting to your skin. So decreasing heat loss through radiation. But in severe hypothermia, this is severely blunted, and we're not getting the vasoconstriction, which was so important for keeping the blood from the warm blood from getting to the surface. So what's happening, this is one cause of the breakdown. Your blood starts going to your skin, and the skin starts getting cold because the environment's really cold, right? So your skin starts getting really cold, matching the temperature of the outside environment. And then that blood is getting worked back to your heart. So it's like a vicious cycle at this point. It's almost no coming back from now. So we're seeing slowing down of heart rate, could lead to cardiac arrest at this point, loss of reflexes. So all those reflexes we talked about right at the start when we talked about the nervous system, those automatic nerve reflexes that we can see across different animals that are evolutionary, that they start to not work. So serious trouble now. We get this thing called terminal burrowing, which could also, which is sort of like an evolutionary impulse, I guess. That could happen. Paradoxical undressing could happen here if it didn't happen previously. And the respiration is so low, 7 to 4 breaths per minute. That's called hypoventilation. Hypo, so under breathing. That and the reason we need to breathe out is to get rid of the carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide is accumulating, and carbon dioxide dissolved in a solution, we get acidic solution. So if you think about fizzy drinks, they got carbon dioxide, they are acidic. So we're getting carbonic acid, we're getting acidosis of the blood, and this damages cells and leads to organ failure. So that's how you can get an excellence. You need to go into detail about that. I've got some resources I'll show you at the end where you can learn more about that or go over it again. Now I'm going to keep going because I realize this video is already 16 minutes and I wanted to keep it under 20. So conditions, you could alternatively talk about hyperthermia. So if you want to talk about hyperthermia, talk about how it could happen in the task that you're given, in the context that you're given. So is the person perhaps not taking off their layers of clothing for the sweating mechanism to be effective? So that's one way it could happen. Exercising in hot conditions. If it's humid, remember evaporation, which is how sweating really works effectively. If evaporation is not happening because it's too humid, then that's a condition that can cause hyperthermia as well. Okay, so over here, I just thought there's some interesting, if you click on this Google site, if you click on those newspaper articles, it'll take you to some examples of when hypothermia has occurred. Unfortunately, it happens all the time, especially with soldiers, because if you think about it, you could just Google a soldier dies of hypothermia and you'll get from all around the world different examples of when it's happened in recent times. So I'm really surprised that it still keeps happening, knowing what we know now. So what's happening is that if you think about it, soldiers have got the long sleeves and the long pants and they don't take those off. It's their camo wear. So their sweating mechanism isn't working. They're not getting the evaporation that they should be getting. Not only that, some of their training is in hot tropical environments and they are trained to push through discomfort. So it's like a perfect storm for hypothermia. And if they don't have enough water, if they're not replacing their fluids, they're not replacing the water lost through sweating or the electrolytes lost through sweating. Okay, this is the Google Doc that you should have done. If you haven't, I recommend you go and you do it now. So you can really understand. You don't need to understand both. You don't need to understand hypo and hyperthermia, but choose one of them and really understand the mechanism. Why the mechanism's not working, or like why we're getting these extremes in effector responses. Okay, so again, this is the example of the breakdown. So you'll do it the same way as hypothermia. Go through the different stages. So we've got heat fatigue first. Here are some of the things that could happen, and they're the explanations as to why. We've got heat exhaustion. We're heading towards a breakdown. Hyponatremia, so low blood sodium, because remember when you sweat, you're sweating your electrolytes as well. So you're losing sodium, which is really important in muscle contractions, including heart muscle contractions. If we keep going, you can get hypovolemic shock, and that is going to lead to organ failure. All right, so that's your breakdown. You'd have to go into detail about that. And I'm going to finish up here with, it's just a couple of excellent resources. So if you click on this video, or this video here, it's a really good explanation of how the eventual decrease in sympathetic nervous system, especially from 36 to 45 minutes, leads to a breakdown. If you want to do hypothermia, from 35 minutes it explains the breakdown, but I would watch the whole thing. If you want to get a mirror, or if you want to get an excellence for the disruption, watch one of those whole video, take notes. That's really going to help you. So the question that you want to be answering to get the excellence is, at what point does body temperature keep increasing or decreasing, and why? So if you watch, like for example, for the hypothermia, 36 to 45 minutes, you're going to see how the guy talks about how, what I was mentioning before, how the vasodilation happens, and then you're getting that blood is getting cold because it's eventually matching the temperature on the outside environment, and that cold blood is getting pumped through the heart and repumped through the body. Not a good situation. So I think that's all about the disruption. Yeah, so they're the main points about the disruption. And any questions, don't hesitate to ask me. Good luck.